Thank you to everybody who's here. I must be careful to say good day rather than anything more precise because I think we're in different time zones. This is the third session, a general discussion on week one. Marina's spoke on air traffic control last week. Today we're talking about airport economics. There are three co-authors, Hans Martin, myself, and Peter Forsyth. Peter will give the talk this morning, indeed today. He will talk about an aspect of airports which I think is keenly appreciated by economists, but maybe not so much by industry people. And that is to do with using airport charges, airport prices, and airport slot regimes with a view to getting the most out of the airport infrastructure. Because there are three authors on this book, if I may recycle a joke, it means we can each blame the other two for anything that's disputed or maybe an error. So I'll hand over to Peter now in a second. He has some slides here to take us through some of the topics. And then I'll have a few questions myself for him. And we will certainly be able to accept questions that are submitted by participants in the seminar. So, Peter.
Good. Well, thanks very much, Cathal, and thanks everyone for coming. And I'll say good morning, afternoon, evening, etc. So this book is one of a number of books which, could you put the next slide in, please? Good. This is actually a book which is there's a series of books on basically air transport under the editorship of John King, and it's being published by Routledge. And there are books by Barry Humphries, and I think we'll be looking at his book next week. And then a few weeks later, we'll be looking at the book by Mike Brown. Now, there's also another book on, this time, airport regulation. It's an edited book, which I've been one of the editors of, and also Hans Martin as well. And I'm not sure whether Eric Pels and Jürgen Müller are here, but nonetheless. And so that is another book which, in a sense, something of, while it wasn't intended to be this way, is sort of a pigeon pair with the book that we'll be discussing. So one is about airports generally, and then a very important aspect is airport regulation, and we'll have that discussed in a few weeks' time. Now, this book, our book, was launched last week by Willie Walsh. He specially came into Dublin to launch the book. He did, I think, have a couple of other things to do as well. Nonetheless, there we are. There's Cathal and Willie Walsh. And so Willie is very pleased to get his book and has been reading it on the plane back. Okay, now there have been several, thank you. There are several books that have been produced about airports. There's a book by O'Donoghue on airport operations. And then Anne Graham has done a couple of books, one on marketing and one on management. And then there's a book on airport finance, but there hadn't been anything on airport economics. Now, as it turns out, there are now two books because David Starkey has also brought out a book just recently on airport businesses, really, I think you might put it. So, okay, so that said, we'll just have a look at some of the things that are in the book that we'll discuss here today. It's trying to be a comprehensive look. And so we start off with a chapter on forecasting and location and that sort of thing. And then we go on to costs, and then pricing and capacity allocation. And that's what I'll be talking about in particular today. And then we get on to part 2, looking at ownership and privatization issues, regulation and efficiency. And then we move on to part 3, which is the environment. We look particularly at the 2 big externalities of airports, namely noise and climate change externalities. And then we finish off with a discussion of economic impacts and some discussion about COVID. So the book is intended to be both a positive analysis, and in other words, try to talk about things as they are, and then a discussion of what things should be, the policy questions. So we're trying to sort of merge all of those things together. Okay, then, well, firstly, what I'll do is just go through 5 questions which are present in that chapter, the chapter 4, which is pricing and capacity allocation. Okay, so just to talk about pricing briefly, how was it done? Well, for many years, it was based on aircraft weight. And so the heavier the aircraft, the more it was charged. Now, there's been a bit of a trend towards passenger-based charging, which doesn't have a big difference economically. Okay, so that being said, why that particular approach? Now, one thing you need to know is that airports, and particularly runways, have big sunk costs. They're fixed costs and they're sunk costs. So you build a runway, and after then, the costs are not not very great. So you've got to essentially get a system of covering the costs. And one way to do that is to have a pricing system which covers cost. But the idea is to try and do it in a way that doesn't create too much distortion in the sense of various possible users being priced out of the market. Now, if you would have a uniform pricing system, i.e., every flight is charged the same, you'd find that the small flights, the small aircraft, would be priced out of the market. And you don't want that because you've got plenty of capacity. So we want to have the airport being used to actually serve the airlines rather than anything else. Alternatively, you can have some other system, and for example, the weight-based system relating the airport charges to the aircraft weight, or a passenger-based system will do that. In other words, if you have a small aircraft, it won't be charged very much, and it will still come, and so on. So that's the idea of airport pricing. That's the basics. Okay. So let's move on to the second issue, second question. I'm waiting. Good, thank you. Number 2, please. Number 2. Yes, thank you. What happens when demand exceeds supply? So what happens with airports is that mostly airports have plenty of capacity. Most do. However, larger airports, and particularly busy ones, nowadays will often have a lack of capacity. It's an airport which can handle, let's say, 40 flights a day, an hour, but there's more than 40 that come along. So what do you do? Well, there's the way that happened with airports is that a slot system emerged. Remember, this is happening over time, over the years. And so initially, there's plenty of capacity in just about every airport. But then Heathrow, 1960s, is becoming very crowded, and others, etc. So what happened was that they set up a slot system. So the airline had to have an airport slot in order to operate at a particular time. So, for example, an airline wants to fly in to London Heathrow at 6 p.m. It needed to have a slot for 6 to 7 p.m. and so on. So it needed to have a slot. And so what happened then was that the slot is being used as the rationing device, how it works. Okay. As it turns out, a slot over time can become very valuable. In Heathrow, a slot that is simply a slot pair flying the right for an airline to fly in and out of the airport was sold for $75 million. That was about 5 or 6 years ago. So that's I think the record. So it can be very, very valuable if it's a popular airport. Okay, so that's the idea. So there is a slot system that applies to most airports other than US airports. There are some airports in the United States that operate with a slot system, but not very many at all. Okay, so that's what happens. The slot system is imposed and so on. Okay, so next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, what about these slots? Who actually owns these slots? Well, that's a tricky question. It's not as though there is a clear ownership, but with slots, it's really a matter of squatters' rights. In other words, possession is 9/10 of the law. In other words, if you've got a slot in let's say Heathrow or Gatwick or Frankfurt or Amsterdam, well, you keep it. And so every so often there's once every 6 months, there is a conference where there's a bit of slot exchanging and so on, and a few extra slots become available, and a few extra airlines are wanting slots and so on. But basically, once you've got your slots, you keep with them. It's what's called a system of grandfather rights. Okay, well, so that's the start, that's the basing idea. But then there's a sort of secondary question. Can there be different systems of slot allocation? Well, there are 3 that really are important. One is there could be an auction for slots. And this actually happened a bit in the United States quite a few years ago, but it's very rare. Then we could have a system of administered slots. In other words, you've got the grandfathered rights there, and once you've got it, you keep it, and so on. And there's no real trading between the different airlines, or at least no formal trading. You can't just go in and say, well, I'd like to buy a slot, please. Airlines might like to get an extra slot, but the other airlines won't sell it to you. Well, they might do some sort of side deal and so on, but it's all very unclear what happens. Then, thirdly, you could have a system of what's called secondary trading. And this actually happens in the United Kingdom. In other words, slots are marketable in the UK, say slots for Gatwick or Heathrow. And so if an airline which doesn't have a slot wants to get one, then it can see if it can buy one. And if it's lucky, it will buy one. It may have to pay a high price, but nonetheless, it can get it. So these slots can become extremely valuable, as I've mentioned. Now, of course, there are the three major ways in which slots are sort of changed hands and so on. There are several lines of criticism of how the slot system works. There's all sorts of problems that come up. There's slot hoarding, there are ghost flights, and there's slot babysitting, and so on. But by and large, that's the system, that there is a slot system, and it works fairly well, but there are some problems. Okay, so let's have a look then at the next question. What about peak pricing? Now, economists love peak pricing. When you've got an infrastructure industry, often there is peak pricing. So that you'll find in many countries, there is peak pricing of your electricity. There's peak pricing of hotels. And indeed, you'll even find peak pricing in airline seats. So you'd think, well, okay, if this is the case, what about airports? Surely there should be some peak pricing. And the interesting thing is, by and large, there isn't any. There is a little bit here and there, but airports do not have significant peak pricing. What happens is that the slot system works as a form of peak pricing. So that, for example, an airline might want to buy, let's say in the UK, it would like to buy a slot, and thinking about one, say, at 6 p.m. in the peak, then it might find that it would cost it maybe, say, $20 million. On the other hand, if it wants to operate at, say, 1 p.m. in the afternoon, it might find that it only costs, say, $10 million. So what's happening then is that there is a peak pricing of slots rather than peak pricing of the airport in its relationship with the airline. The airline simply pays the same amount whether it's buying a peak slot or not. It's just that if it's going to get a slot, you'll have to pay high prices at the peak. So that's what's happening. So there is a form of peak pricing, but it's really peak pricing of slots, not the airport itself. Okay, well, let's have a look at the fifth and final point or question. As I mentioned, there are several problems which the slot system creates. One thing is that the slot system works pretty well, not perfectly as I mentioned, but it's fairly good in the short run allocation problem. In other words, handling a fixed amount of capacity, let's say 2 runways, and it can be a good way of allocating that fixed amount of capacity to the airlines. So that's fine. But what about the long run question? What about investment in new capacity? What about if there's a need for new capacity? For example, there are 2 runways at the airport, like at London, Heathrow, and there's really a need for a 3rd runway. Okay. Will the slot system deter investment in new capacity? And the answer is yes. Because what happens is that when there is a new runway built, you've now got, let's say, a lot more capacity available in the system, and it means that the slots become much less valuable. So if that's the case, when you think about it, what's the interest so far as the airline is concerned? Well, does it want new capacity being built? Now, as it turns out, when you find airlines, let's say there's a new airport being, a new runway being suggested, say for London Heathrow, you'd think, oh, okay, what will the airlines think about that? The trouble is that they don't want the new capacity. So, just as an example, what happens with London Heathrow, for years and years and years, British Airways was saying, well, there's too little capacity at London Heathrow Airport. This is a disgrace. We're going to base our operations in Madrid rather than in London. And so they said things like that. Then the British government said, well, actually, we'd like to build, or let the owners build a new runway. We'll approve of it. And as soon as that happened, and as soon as it looked like the airport might get the 3rd runway, British Airways said, oh, no, this is terrible. We don't want to pay for it, because they were realizing that their slots would become much less valuable. So that's happened in a number of cases elsewhere. I know it happened in Australia with Sydney and elsewhere. When there is a proposal for new investment, when it's quite clear that it's a need for this new capacity is there, the airlines quite often say, oh, not just yet. No, we don't really need it. this new capacity, because we're realizing that their slot values will fall. Okay, so that means that there is an incentive for the airlines to, try to deter investment in new capacity, which will basically make their slots less valuable. And so that makes sometimes of a problem when your main customer is going around saying, look, we don't need this extra capacity, when it's clear that there is a need for new capacity. Okay, then, well, I'll just finish off there now. So there's just 5 points that emerge from the chapter 4. And so I'll pass on to Cathal, who will carry on from here.
Okay, so a question or a remark then, Peter, on the issue of whether airports favor and are willing themselves to introduce differential pricing, peak pricing, and then secondly, the attitude of airlines, because I think in the second case, there are aspects to be puzzled by. So regarding the airport, I would expect commercial airports, owners like Macquarie and so on, wouldn't hesitate for a second to change the price structure. But government-owned airports are restricted, in my experience, by an unwillingness to, let's say, annoy some of their main customers. So even though it might be financially advantageous, if they're government-owned, if profit isn't the main goal, then efficiency doesn't become the main goal either, compared to keeping their large customers satisfied. And I'll roll that into a second question. It's a little bit of a surprise to me regarding airline attitudes, that if an efficient pricing structure caused investment to happen at a more appropriate time, very expensive investment in a parallel runway or something like that, the gains to the airlines of a price structure that might affect them differentially the cost to the airline of a peak pricing now might be offset over a longer horizon by deferring until the right time the impact on airport charges on the average from investments in expensive infrastructure. So I don't know what you think about those observations on the industry's attitude to peak pricing.
Yes, well, it is really quite interesting that basically that the airlines really don't like peak pricing if it is the airport that's doing the peak pricing. But of course, they're doing peak pricing all the time. I mean, a peak pricing, the classic example nowadays is airline pricing. So that's, yeah. Now, of course, the different motivations of the airports can be quite different. And so an airport which is government owned, of course, might have some particular objectives. Another, if it's privately owned and very obviously a profit maximizing sort of airport, of which there aren't very many, they might have a different one. And it's interesting that of the examples of using a bit of pricing that I've come across, well, Sydney's had a little bit of peak pricing and Brisbane a little bit of peak pricing, and they are privately owned, privatized airports. And there's still not anything like 100% peak pricing. They still use slots a lot. It's going to be interesting in the next few years what Sydney Airport does. Now, Sydney Airport was owned by the Macquarie Bank, which was very keen on raising revenue for itself. Not so much now, there's a new owner, but it is, I guess, one of the most likely of airports to want to go in for peak pricing. And it's going to be interesting to see how that develops, particularly that there's another airport being built to add to the airport capacity in Sydney.
Okay, we've had a couple of questions on slot issues, Peter.
Yeah.
One from Hans Martin is whether, even if slots act to achieve peak pricing at the peak, they may not contribute much at all in regard to appropriate off-peak pricing. Do you agree?
Oh, yes, that's true. Well, there'll be a difference between the peak and the off-peak charge. And of course, for a lot of airports, it will be the case that you have to pay for a peak slot and nothing for an off-peak slot. And so, because, you know, there's plenty of capacity around and nobody is going to pay for a slot. So, yeah.
A comment then from Barry Humphreys, or a question from Barry Humphreys, was whether the proportion of slots that are actually traded on a secondary market is on a sufficient. It's a theoretical possibility, but it may not actually affect appropriate pricing of airports in very many places.
I think that that's a good question, because one thought that people in the Department for Transport in the United Kingdom, they're actually looking at that particular question. And it's interesting that there is slot trading at Heathrow and at Gatwick, but there's not nearly as much as you might have thought, with airlines wanting to come and go and all that sort of thing. And so this is a question that the department is actually looking at the moment, that there doesn't seem, you know, it's an interesting thing that this is not a market which is as thick as you might have expected. Now, does that mean that the trading is not efficient or not? Well, maybe if it's a fairly thin market, maybe it's not clear that it's going to give you inefficient results, but it's not clear that it's basically an unclear issue at the moment.
Okay. There's a comment there from David Starkey about an experiment that was done in Dublin, in fact, about peak pricing of the runway, which is an interesting example of the limits of regulatory intervention here. And at the time, of course, David was advising the regulator in Dublin. So it was me and others at the time, were keen to compel the airport to apply peak pricing on the runway. And with the power only to set a maximum charge, but no power to set a minimum, we simply set a price cap, a sub-price cap on the off-peak times for the then single runway, which forced the airport to apply a higher charge at other times if they wanted to collect their full allowance for charges. Now, we were very pleased with that. About 1 month later, 9/11 occurred, and the entire structure of flights and traffic over the day and over the year completely changed. The airlines cut services and filled their planes more, but the times of the day and the weeks, let's say, of the year, which were peak and off-peak, completely changed. We had imposed a minimum price for off-peak times, or maximum price for off-peak times, which was enforced for 5 years, but which no longer fitted the structure of demand. And the lesson we learned really was that regulation is too crude to be able to do this kind of thing. And you really need the airport to be willing to do so when it can modify from season to season, from year to year, what the structure of those charges, what the definition of off-peak times and all the rest is. Although subsequently there wasn't some avenue found to make the airport do so. But that was an experiment which was done, an attempt to use the regulatory system to make the airport be efficient. But there were practical challenges there.
Yes, I just comment that this highlights the fact that it's very difficult to be very pointed or accurate if you're actually trying to regulate. That you can have broad brush regulations saying, here's the price cap, that's it, sort of thing. But when you start going into various details, it becomes more and more difficult, basically.
It's David Starkey. Can I butt in verbally here?
Please.
So, Cathal, that was a very good summary of the Dublin situation. However, what I was getting at was at the end of my sentence, really, and that the airport, Dublin Airport, aligned itself with the airlines objecting to the peak pricing. They were not in favour of it at all. And that attitude could have been motivated, and it comes back to Peter's point earlier about investment. That attitude of Dublin Airport, aligning itself with the airlines to object to any pricing differential, was due to the fact that they had pending a application or plan, I forget exactly what stage it had got to, for an additional runway, for a second runway at Dublin. And of course, I suspect they saw the fact that if you had differential pricing, this was going to reduce the and more efficient use of the existing runway. This was going to reduce the case for that second runway. And as Cathal knows, they were extremely keen to build that second runway, and they subsequently have done so.
No, I think that's exactly right. Airports that are not profit motivated are often, as we know, size motivated, and they like to add to infrastructure very much. Had they built the parallel runway at that time when they wanted to, it would have been 1 or 2 decades too early, as it turned out. Now, the second runway has been opened very recently, and the use of the slots and the lobbying by the airlines about availability of slots is consistent with what you would expect about based airlines not wanting slots to be provided other than at the rate at which they can demand them themselves. So that's another feature here. Hans Martin points out that there is, in fact, more than in normal times, there is actually discussion and contemplation of reform of the slot rules at the present time. Discussed earlier in the year at the OECD, prompted by the UK government, which now has more discretion in aviation policy than previously. There was a GARS seminar in Amsterdam. It's a topic that's also due for discussion at the European Aviation Conference at the end of November, beginning of December in Luxembourg. And anybody with a particular interest in the slot issue might consider participating in that session and hearing what is said there.
Yes, just to on that, the Dublin experience ties in nicely with the Sydney experience. So you've got Dublin, which is a publicly owned airport, which has been given quite a lot of leeway by its public owners to do what it wants, and it wants to build things. Whereas Sydney, it was given the right to build a new airport when it wanted to, when it needed to. And what it did was it kept saying, no, we don't need a new airport for so many years and so on. I think it wanted to build a new airport in 2046 or something. Said we don't need any more capacity until then, mind you. And then the government actually stepped in more or less and said, well, okay, this is ridiculous. You're running out of airport capacity. We'll basically set up another airport, which can compete with it, and so on. So the private airport wanted to, basically not expand, but allow the airlines to gather substantial rents, and probably it got a slice of that as well. Because after all, it's not required by regulation to have a maximum price. It can charge a bit more than, say, cost, let's say, and it can make some profits as well as the airlines by having too little capacity.
Okay, so we have approximately 10 minutes left. I do see one more question now. If people also wanted to unmute maybe and ask a question. Are there other questions from participants that come to mind straight away?
Yeah, I I was wondering about airport competition. I'm not sure it has been covered in the discussion until now. Maybe I've missed it. And the other is the commercial revenues and the discussion about single till, dual till. I think these are two quite important topics. So it would be nice if you perhaps could share your views on this.
Yes, we have. This is quite a long chapter, but we did have a look at the question about single tills and dual tills. We don't have a set view that one's better than the other, etc. But we do have, basically, we say, well, there's this and that. This effect has there and that has there and so on. The pluses and minuses and so on. And it does, and we actually did go into, admittedly in rather little detail, the argument that David Starkey has been associated with for a number of years, and that is that by having, what could happen is that the airport has something of an incentive to lower its aeronautical prices, because it will pick up non-aeronautical revenues. So by having a lower price for one impacts the revenues for the other, and that this is a sort of a reason why in some cases there may be less of a case for regulation. I don't know whether David wants to say anything more about that, but that's one thing that, and then of course there has been quite a lot of literature to which, I mean, Achim, you've contributed, and others, all stemming from that sort of observation.
Maybe I can just comment on this. What I always think is that actually it also works the other way around. So maybe, you know, it's unclear whether it is really the good strategy to reduce, to make aeronautical services cheap in order to have some additional revenue from commercial revenues, or the other way around, make the airport a very convenient airport, have it very cheap and very good service at a low price, so that you can then charge a higher price for aeronautical services. Of course, it is often a little bit difficult to implement because usually it's aeronautical charges and not the non-aeronautical charges that are regulated. But still, I mean, if there is an airport which is unregulated, why not, you know, following this strategy? You know, it will depend on some like cross-price elasticities and so on. But I think there is no, you know, clear reason for why it should be working only in one direction. It's a little bit unclear whether incorporating commercial services would actually have a negative effect on profit maximizing aeronautical charges, or the other way around.
Yeah.
Just can I, Cathal, can I come in? I've debated by email this issue with Achim, and I think the basic point here is that you got to look at the cross elasticities involved, and when you consider the cross elasticities, and you come up really with the realization that the incentive is really on the airport to reduce its aeronautical charges as opposed to its commercial charges. And this is because, on the whole, the elasticities with respect to commercial charges, the price of the coffee or the price of the sandwich in the terminal, is generally price inelastic, whilst the response of the passenger to the airline ticket price is relatively elastic. And therefore, the incentive is really, in terms of the airport reducing the aeronautical charge, to try and incentivize the passenger market to increase the actual volume of traffic through the airport. Increasing that volume of traffic, it picks up more commercial revenues, but those commercial revenues are not particularly price sensitive. That was my response to Achim when we had an email interchange.
Okay, we've looked at that particular issue a little bit now, although plainly more could be said. Are there other aspects of airport economics or the issues that Peter has mentioned there that might be rehearsed that people would like to give some time to?
How about the competition part? Oh, Hans-Jochen is also there, but I think we talked about now commercial, but I think the airport competition part is also very important.
So maybe Peter would say a word about that, then we go to Hans-Jochen, and we might be finishing up with Barry about next week.
Yes, I mean, the issue, of course, of whether there's airport competition or not, etc., is often quite is obviously a very important one often. Now, in the chapter that I've just been discussing, we don't really go into the competition issue very much. We basically said, well, here are the ideas about pricing and slots and what have you. Another section of the book, however, we do have a discussion of airport competition and how it will affect pricing, etc., etc. I've forgotten which chapter it is. Do you remember?
Oh, sorry.
Anyway, there is a chapter, and yeah, and that actually we also have a substantial chapter in the other book, the edited book on airport regulation, and basically we start off with the question: well, do you necessarily have to have regulation? If airports are competitive, then regulation may not be necessary.
Yeah. If I may
just a second, Hans Martin. I think Hans Jochen had a question maybe first. Is that correct?
Maybe Hans Martin will answer to the previous question, and then I come with my question.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one of the things is I'm guessing what Achim might be up to, but if you think that there's not enough peak and congestion pricing from airports because they are publicly run or partially privatized, then you could say, well, with fully privatized airports, they might do that. Now, and the other argument is then with competition, whether they are private or public, they also might be forced to do peak pricing. But that's, well, we don't see that. Yeah. So the competition is not really driving the airports to a better pricing of the capacity, which also would increase their revenues and their profits. I think that, so that would be my answer. And that's.
But that's so, except that we have to see what regulation is doing. And so what you have to have is a situation whereby the airport has the freedom to go in for peak pricing if it wants to. Now, that is the case, as far as I can understand, in the Australian airports, which are subject to light-handed regulation. Yeah. Now, and they are airports that have, shall we say, dipped their toe into water about pricing. They haven't done much, but they've done a little bit. And they're the ones that you would have expected to have been most likely. On the other hand, say it might, with airports that are still fairly tightly regulated, like say London Heathrow, there's no particular reason why they should go in for peak pricing. It's not clear that they would gain from it.
Okay, Hans-Jochen?
Okay, I would like to come back briefly to the slot problem, especially that airlines don't like airport expansion because then the value of the slot decreases. Isn't it only when we have secondary trading that then the value decreases, but that all airlines at any airport, independent of secondary trading, don't like the expansion because as long as there is no expansion, they are in a monopoly situation or they avoid competition. So this would be then a competitive value for me.
Yes, well, I think you've answered the question in the second part of your question, namely, it's perfectly clear if there is, let's say, a situation like in the UK, where there is obvious trading, okay, with the airports that are not in countries where trading is encouraged or even permitted in a sense, then what happens there is that there is, shall we say, grey markets will form. And it's still the case that the slots have very substantial value, and the airlines value their slots a lot, and they still don't want to have expansion, because those slots will become less valuable. And of course, what will happen is that they will get less revenue, because the slot premium that will, as it were, be there, won't be there if there is a lot more capacity. So that the other side of the picture is I didn't mention it, but there's this slot premium. For example, in London, it's been calculated in various ways that it's quite a substantial premium on slots that come about. Sorry, I'll say it again. There'll be a substantial premium on the price of the ticket, because the airline will be able to charge more because they have a slot at an airport which has too little capacity. So the slot premium is there nonetheless, even though there may not be slot trading of the actual slots themselves.
Okay, Barry has a comment.
Yes, I did want to come back and thank you for, it's useful that this point's been raised at the end here, because I did want to come back on it. I mean, I can understand how you can construct a theoretical argument that airlines with slots will oppose the expansion of an airport. But in practice, that just doesn't happen, because I think it ignores many of the commercial arguments. If an airline, say a British Airways at Heathrow, if it wants to, if it regards its slots as having a value, they only have a value if you can sell the slots. But if you sell the slots, you are quite literally destroying your business and increasing the competitiveness of your competitors. So it's not a theoretical, it's not a realistic option for most airlines. And Peter argued that British Airways had opposed the expansion of Heathrow. That is simply not the case. I've been involved in the Heathrow expansion arguments for many years. I can assure you, British Airways has not opposed the expansion of Heathrow, quite the reverse. What it has done is oppose the building of another runway by the current owner because of the excessive expense involved. That's quite a different argument. So I think the argument about airlines opposing airport expansion is much more complex than perhaps the theoretical position would suggest. Thank you.
Yes, well, I just come to it. I mean, it's still the case that, well, on that aspect, I mean, there are all sorts of other aspects that I've simply, not mentioned and so on. So it's certainly true that there are lots of other aspects and so on. It's certainly true that, but then when we talk about the slot premium, if the airport puts a new runway in, the slot premium for the airline, in other words, when it's selling its tickets, it will fall, and that's where the value falls. So certainly the airline will lose if the new runway is introduced, because there's no point in, well, you won't be able to have a Heathrow slot premium if there's plenty of capacity at Heathrow. And so that still remains. So it's not so much a matter of, buying and selling slots. What's really important is being able to have the slot premium at an airport which everyone wants to go to. I'm not quite sure why in the case of Heathrow.
But Peter, What about the ability to expand? If you oppose the expansion of an airport such as Heathrow, then airlines like British Airways have no ability to expand, and that has a value for the airline as well, which has to be taken into account.
Yes, yes, I agree. I think that's a valid point. Yeah.
Achim, do you have a comment here?
Yeah, Barry was saying that the airline wasn't opposing the expansion, but sort of was unwilling to support it because it was the costs were considered to be too high, if I understand correctly. I think it's a little bit, if I would be British Airways, if I would be opposing the expansion, perhaps that's what I would be saying. Oh, it's too expensive. I wouldn't be saying, oh, I don't like this project overall. It's just, I would say, okay, it's too expensive, therefore I don't support. So I think the very fact that they, raise this point, it's not a proof that, it's not a proof for one thing or the other, I would say. It basically, it's relatively meaningless. At the end, it means that the runway is sort of delayed or will not be even constructed or constructed with a delay. So it's not very clear what it means.
Just as an example of that, on the parallel runway now in Dublin, next summer, next season, EasyJet has slots. So that would be their first time using Dublin, almost their first time in head-to-head competition with Ryanair. So that could be a very interesting situation. And then a test of slots, I suppose. Now, I think we're just past the hour, and I'll go back to Barry, if I may, because he will be speaking next week, and maybe he would introduce briefly next week's.
Excuse me, Cathal, could
Right.
we just show the slide with the how to buy the book?
Absolutely.
That's the most important thing.
Of course.
And that's true for Barry's book as well. So next week, so if you don't, even if people don't want to buy Barry's book, our book, they might like to know how to get Barry's book. Sorry. Now,
Okay, just seeking to do that now. Get to the right page.
No, the one before.
Yeah. There we are.
There we are. So there we are. There's the discount code for a 30% discount, but it ends at the end of this week, this year.
Okay. We'll leave that there, and maybe Barry will mention about next week, please.
Thank you. Yes, next week we're going to be discussing my book, which covers the liberalisation of excuse me.
Is that what we're going to discuss?
It covers the liberalisation of air transport, looking at the developments since the Chicago Convention and how liberalisation has emerged and the problems we face going forward, and also looks at regulation of airports and air traffic control and various other issues. And it'll be slightly different from the presentation we had today, because I'll be joined by Andrew Charlton, who I'm sure will be thinking up lots of difficult questions and challenges. So we'll be able to have, hopefully, a debate on the issues raised in my book. Thank you.
So as a very final comment on slots, there's an observation in the chat about something I wasn't aware of, where the issue of slots and slot trading also arises in the railway sector. And apparently there's a technical prohibition, but actually some slot trading taking place, and that might raise the question, or does raise the question, of whether different actors in the industry have greater capacity to avail of that.
Yes.
So look, we're 7 minutes past
another
an hour.
example. Sorry, it was in Australian ports. There is some slot system and also that is being looked at by the Australian Competition Commission, because they are quite interested in what's going on there.
Okay, well then, thank you very much to Peter for his presentation, to all of you for attending, and for those who provided questions to enable our discussion to proceed. And we're hoping, of course, to see you all back in 1 week's time. And as Hans Martin has remarked in the chat, many of these issues today, other week's issues, will also be discussed at the end of November at the European Aviation Conference. And you can register for that at the conference website online under European Aviation Conference.